Today we are going to explore one of the most silenced and complex chapters of European history: polygamy in the Middle Ages, its ancestral roots, its manifestations among kings and peasants, and the slow process by which monogamy became the dominant norm in the West. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this. A little over 1,000 years ago, somewhere in the lands we now call Europe, a powerful man woke up next to a woman who was not his wife. This was not a stealthy affair hidden in the dark corners of a castle. It was something known, accepted, and even expected. In the stone corridors of medieval palaces, in torchlit halls where nobles sealed deals and forged alliances, the rules of marriage were very different from those we know today. What today would be considered infidelity or scandal was, at that time, an instrument of power, a tool of diplomacy, and, in many cases, a practice, protected by centuries-old laws and traditions. To understand how medieval Europe dealt with the issue of multiple marital unions, one must go back in time, cross centuries of religious, political, and social transformations, and travel a path that will lead us from the pages of the Old Testament to the decrees of the great councils of Christendom, passing through the icy fjords of Scandinavia, the green hills of Ireland, and the glittering palaces of Muslim Iberia. This is a story about power, faith, desire, and control, about how societies constructed and deconstructed the rules of love and marriage over the centuries. And it begins long before the Middle Ages proper. In the ancient lands of the Middle East, millennia before any knight raised his sword in the name of a European king, the sacred scriptures that would come to ground three of the world's greatest religions already described, with naturalness, the practice of keeping multiple wives. In the Old Testament, a sacred book for Jews and Christians, some of the most revered figures lived in marital arrangements that included several women. Abraham, considered the patriarch of the three monotheistic religions, kept a primary wife, Sarah, and a concubine, Hagar, with whom he fathered Ishmael. The biblical narrative does not condemn this union. On the contrary, it is presented as part of a larger plan, as a natural unfolding of the life of a man blessed by God. Jacob, Abraham's grandson, went even further. He married two sisters, Leah and Rachel, and also had children with two handmaids, Bilhah and Zilpah. His 12 sons gave rise to the 12 tribes of Israel, which means that the very foundation of the Hebrew people is rooted in a polygamous family structure. And it was not just a matter of lineage. Each of these unions brought with it implications of power, alliances between families, and guarantees of continuity for the bloodline. The most emblematic case, however, is that of King David, and above all his son Solomon. David, described in the scriptures as a man after God's own heart, kept several wives throughout his life, among them Michal, Abigail, and Bathsheba. Each of these marriages had a political and strategic component, but it was Solomon who took the practice to the extreme. According to the first book of Kings, Solomon possessed 700 wives of royal blood and 300 concubines. These numbers, even if they may contain some degree of literary exaggeration, reflect a historical reality in which marriage was, above all, a tool of diplomacy. Marrying princesses from neighboring nations was a way to seal alliances, ensure peace between rival peoples, and expand a kingdom's influence without necessarily resorting to war. Polygamy, in this context, was not seen as lust or immorality. It was strategy. It was governance. It was the language of power translated into matrimonial bonds. These traditions became deeply rooted in Middle Eastern societies and gradually influenced the peoples who would form the cultural and religious basis of Europe. When Christianity began to spread through the Roman world, starting from the 1st century after Christ, it carried with it the heritage of these scriptures. However, the new religious movement also brought a radical reinterpretation of the relationship between man and woman. The Gospels, the central texts of the New Testament, say relatively little about marriage itself. Jesus Christ, according to biblical accounts, appeared relatively indifferent to the question of polygamy. He condemned adultery and discouraged divorce, but he uttered no direct prohibition against keeping multiple wives. It was in the epistles of Paul of Tarsus, written in the decades following the death of Christ, that the defense of monogamy began to take on more defined shapes. Paul wrote that Christians should not divorce, that those who divorced should not marry again, and that sexual relations outside of marriage were condemnable. For bishops and deacons, the requirement was even clearer. They were to be men of only one wife. These Pauline guidelines planted the seeds of a transformation that would take centuries to consolidate. The early fathers of the Christian Church, in the following centuries, worked to distance Christianity from the Jewish traditions that still accepted polygamy. Gradually, monogamy began to be presented not just as a recommendation, but as the divine model of marriage. The union between one man and one woman began to symbolize the sacred relationship between Christ and his church, a powerful metaphor that gave monogamous marriage unprecedented theological weight. When Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in the early 4th century, this transformation gained institutional strength. Christian Rome began to legally prohibit bigamy, restricted the possibilities for divorce, and made it legally impossible to simultaneously maintain a wife and a concubine. Monogamy ceased to be a religious ideal and became the law of the state. But laws written on parchment do not always correspond to the reality lived in the halls of palaces and the chambers of the powerful, and it is here that the story becomes truly fascinating. While Roman theologians and jurists worked to consolidate monogamy as the norm, the Germanic tribes that inhabited the vast forests north of the Roman Empire lived according to their own codes, very different from Roman and Christian laws. Franks, Saxons, Lombards, and other Germanic peoples maintained matrimonial traditions that included various forms of marital union. Among these peoples, the distinction between formal marriage and concubinage was fluid. A man of high standing could maintain a primary wife, with whom he celebrated a ceremony recognized by the community, and at the same time maintain one or more partners in less formal arrangements that were equally accepted by society. The children born of these unions, although they might have a different status in terms of inheritance, were not necessarily stigmatized. In practice, what existed was a system of multiple partnerships that functioned according to local norms, not the dogmas of the Church of Rome. When these Germanic peoples began to convert to Christianity, starting in the 5th century, a tension was created between their ancestral traditions and the new religious requirements. The conversion of the Franks, for example, is an illustrative case. King Clovis converted to Christianity around the year 496, largely through the influence of his wife Clotilda. But religious conversion did not mean an immediate transformation in matrimonial customs. The Franks continued to maintain polygamous practices for generations after the adoption of Christianity. The Church in this period was still building its authority and did not have enough power to impose its rules on kings and warriors who controlled vast territories and fearsome armies. The result was a long period of negotiation and accommodation, in which the Church preached monogamy from the pulpits, while the powerful continued to live according to their own rules. No example illustrates this contradiction better than the life of Charlemagne, the man who would be crowned Emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day in the year 800, beginning what would later be called the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne is remembered by his biographers not only as a formidable warrior and a competent administrator, but also as a man of considerable marital appetites. According to Einhard, the biographer who lived with the emperor and wrote his life in detail, Charlemagne formally married at least 4 times throughout his life. His first known relationship was with a Frankish woman named Himiltrude, whose relationship with the future emperor is described in various ways by historical sources, sometimes as concubinage, sometimes as informal marriage. With Himiltrude, Charlemagne had a son named Pippin, who became known as Pippin the Hunchback and who would later be involved in a conspiracy against his own father. In 770, Charlemagne formally married Desiderata, daughter of King Desiderius of the Lombards. This union was clearly political, intended to seal an alliance between the Franks and the Lombards. However, the marriage lasted little more than a year. Charlemagne repudiated Desiderata and married Hildegard, a noblewoman from Swabia, with whom he had 9 children throughout a marriage that lasted until Hildegard's death in 783. But even during his marriage to Hildegard, Charlemagne maintained parallel relationships. A woman named Gerswinde, of Saxon origin, became his concubine around 773 and bore him a daughter, Adaltrude. Another concubine, Madelgard, bore him another daughter, Rodheid, born in 775. After Hildegard's death, Charlemagne married again, this time to Fastrada, an East Frankish noblewoman. Einhard was not a great admirer of Fastrada, describing her as beautiful but cruel, and suggesting that her cruelty had provoked conspiracies and revolts, including that of Pippin the Hunchback in 792. Fastrada died in 794, and Charlemagne married for the last time to Luitgard, a woman from Alemannia. When Luitgard passed away in the year 800, the emperor did not marry formally again, but he kept a series of concubines in the final years of his life. Einhard names at least 4 of them: Gerswinde, Regina, Adelinda, and Madelgard. Regina and Adelinda gave Charlemagne 2 sons each, bringing the emperor's total recognized children to about 20. The ecclesiastics surrounding the emperor were not indifferent to this situation. A monk named Veti of Reichenau even reported a vision in which Charlemagne was tormented in the afterlife because of his sexual activities. But during the emperor's life, the church turned a blind eye to his marital arrangements. Charlemagne was too powerful, too generous to the church, and too important for the expansion of Christendom for bishops and abbots to dare confront him openly. This dynamic between secular power and religious authority was, in fact, the dominant pattern in medieval Europe. The church preached monogamy, but needed the patronage of kings and nobles. The kings, in turn, needed the legitimacy that the church's blessing conferred upon their rule. The result was a game of appearances. At all levels of the nobility, feudal lords kept legitimate wives and, at the same time, kept concubines. The children of these parallel unions were called bastards, but many occupied important positions in the church, the army, and the administration. In Charlemagne's own family, the children of his concubines received an education and were directed toward ecclesiastical careers. While this dynamic unfolded in the heart of Western Christendom, in the icy lands of Northern Europe, another set of matrimonial traditions flourished among the Scandinavian peoples. The Vikings, as the Norse warriors and navigators who terrified and fascinated Europe between the 8th and 11th centuries became known, lived according to their own social and legal codes, in which strict monogamy was not the norm. In Norse society, formal marriage existed and was an important event, surrounded by rituals and negotiations between families. The ceremony was called a brudlaup, or sometimes brudkaup, terms that meant something like bride walk or bride purchase. Marriage was, above all, a contract between families, involving negotiations over dowries, properties, and inheritance rights. However, alongside formal marriage, concubinage was widely accepted and practiced, especially among men of high position. A concubine in Norse society was called a frilla, and she had a recognized status, though inferior to that of the primary wife. She lived in the man's home. Her children could inherit from the father if he recognized them, and she herself enjoyed certain legal protection. It was not a clandestine or shameful relationship. It was a social institution with its own rules. The Icelandic sagas, the great narrative texts of medieval Norse culture, are full of references to concubinage and the multiple partnerships of high-status men. The saga of Harald Fairhair, which narrates the life of the king who unified Norway in the 9th century, states simply that King Harald had many wives and proceeds to name 3 of them. This casual, almost unconcerned mention reveals how much the practice was accepted in that society. Foreign travelers and missionaries who visited the Scandinavian lands also recorded these practices. The Arab envoy Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who encountered the so-called Rus, a people of Scandinavian origin, on the banks of the Volga River in the 10th century, described in detail the customs of the Norsemen, including their practices of keeping multiple partners. The reasons for Norse polygamy were manifold. In a society where war was constant and male mortality high, having multiple partners and consequently multiple heirs was a survival strategy for aristocratic lineages. The more children a warrior chief had, the greater the chances that at least one of them would survive to inherit his lands and continue his line. Furthermore, the number of women and concubines a man kept was a direct indicator of his social status and wealth. Maintaining several partners required considerable resources, as the man was legally obligated to support them all, as well as their children. Therefore, polygamy was, in a sense, a display of economic and social power. This created, however, a significant problem for men of lower status. If the chiefs and aristocrats monopolized a disproportionate number of women through polygamy and concubinage, a smaller number of available partners remained for common men. Some modern researchers argue that this scarcity of available women was one of the factors that drove the Viking raids. Young warriors with no prospects of marriage in their homelands embarked on expeditions of plunder and conquest, seeking enough wealth to attract a wife or, in some cases, capturing women in the lands they attacked. It is important to note, however, that Norse society was not simply a paradise for men and a hell for women. Compared to their contemporaries in other parts of Europe, Norse women enjoyed considerable rights. Norse legislation allowed women to have a say in the choice of their husbands, to initiate divorce proceedings if they were dissatisfied with the marriage, and to hold property in their own name. A wife who was mistreated or neglected had the right to divorce and recover her dowry. These legal protections meant that, although polygamy existed, it operated within a framework of rules that offered women certain guarantees. The first wife, in particular, maintained a position of authority within the home that concubines could not easily challenge. The conversion of the Scandinavian peoples to Christianity, a gradual process that extended from the 10th to the 12th century, brought increasing pressure against the practices of polygamy and concubinage. Christian missionaries denounced these practices as sinful and contrary to the will of God. However, as had happened with the Franks centuries before, religious conversion did not mean an immediate change in customs. The sagas written in the 12th and 13th centuries, which describe contemporary events in Iceland and Norway, continue to make frequent references to concubinage, indicating that the practice persisted long after the official adoption of Christianity. To the far west of Scandinavia, on the green and rainy island of Ireland, another unique legal and social system flourished, a system that challenged the norms of continental Christendom in surprising ways. Medieval Ireland was governed by a set of secular laws known as Brehon law, a judicial system maintained and interpreted by professional jurists called brehons. These laws, which existed in parallel with the canon laws of the Church and were only partially eclipsed by the Norman invasion of 1169, regulated all aspects of daily life, including marriage. The most important legal text on Irish marriage is the Cain Lanamna, or Law of Couples, which was written around the year 700 and describes the various types of marital union permitted by Irish law. The Cain Lanamna recognized at least 9 different forms of union, from formal marriage between partners of equal status to temporary and transitory arrangements. This diversity reflected a pragmatic and flexible approach to relations between men and women, very different from the rigidity that the Church sought to impose. Polygamy was explicitly accepted under Brehon law. A man who had sufficient resources could keep more than one wife, although the first wife, known as the primary wife, enjoyed a superior status and specific rights. When a man brought a second wife into the home, the first wife was entitled to a period of 3 days, during which she could express her dissatisfaction in quite physical ways without suffering significant legal consequences, provided she did not cause permanent marks. Some historians suggest that the tradition of the honeymoon, the custom of the newly married couple going away for a period after the ceremony, may have its origins in this practice as a way to protect the new wife from the wrath of the first during this adjustment period. Common concubines in a Gaelic household had a lower status than any wife, but still received legal protection within the house of the man they were involved with. And crucially, the concept of illegitimacy did not exist in Brehon law. All children, regardless of whether they were born to a formal wife, a second wife, a concubine, or even from a casual relationship, had inheritance rights and were legally protected. The central question of the law was not the morality of the relationship that had produced the child, but rather who was legally responsible for their support and upbringing. Irish matrimonial practices persisted for centuries, even after the island's conversion to Christianity. The monastic structure of Irish Christianity, which differed significantly from the ecclesiastical organization of the continent, contributed to this persistence. Ecclesiastical reformers were not slow to denounce Irish customs. In the year 1074, Archbishop Lanfranc of Canterbury wrote to the Irish kings describing the matrimonial unions practiced on the island as abominable exchanges. Even St. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential figures of the Church in the 12th century, expressed his indignation, stating that Bishop Malachy of Armagh had been sent not to men, but to beasts. These condemnations reflected the deep cultural shock between Gaelic traditions and the increasingly rigid norms that the Church was trying to impose throughout Christendom. The replacement of Brehon law with canon law was a slow process, only effectively completed in the 17th century, when English rule over Ireland became absolute. The Catholic Church, aware that its rules on marriage were frequently ignored or bypassed, undertook a continuous effort throughout the Middle Ages to consolidate its control over the institution of marriage. This process did not happen all at once, but was built gradually through a series of councils, decrees, and theological pronouncements that together transformed marriage from a simple contract between families into a sacred sacrament under the exclusive jurisdiction of the Church. One of the most important milestones in this process was the Fourth Council of the Lateran, convened by Pope Innocent III and held in November 1215. This council, often called the Great Council, brought together more than 400 bishops from across Western and Eastern Christendom, as well as hundreds of abbots, priors, and representatives of European monarchs, including envoys from Emperor Frederick II and the kings of France, England, Aragon, Hungary, Cyprus, and Jerusalem. It was the largest ecumenical council since the Council of Chalcedon, held in 451, and its decrees had profound repercussions throughout medieval society. Among the 71 canons promulgated by the Fourth Council of the Lateran, several dealt directly with marriage. Canons 50 to 52 addressed issues of matrimonial impediments due to kinship, the publication of the bans, and, crucially, the prohibition of clandestine marriages. Before 1215, marriage in the Christian world was essentially a private contract between two parties. A man and a woman could validly marry without the presence of witnesses, without a priest, and without any public ceremony. Mutual consent was enough for the union to be considered valid. This flexibility, although it might seem liberating, created enormous problems. It was extremely difficult to prove or contest the existence of a marriage when there were no records or witnesses. Men could claim they had never married a woman, even if she claimed the opposite. And, conversely, someone could claim the existence of a previous marriage to prevent a new union. The Fourth Council of the Lateran sought to resolve these problems by requiring that marriages be publicly proclaimed in advance through the so-called bans of marriage, so that anyone who knew of a legitimate impediment could present it before the ceremony. The council also formally elevated marriage to the status of a sacrament, placing it under the direct jurisdiction of the Church and making it a sacred and, in principle, indissoluble bond. However, as frequently happened in the Middle Ages, the distance between law and practice was considerable. The decrees of the Fourth Council of the Lateran did not eliminate informal polygamy overnight. Kings and nobles continued to keep mistresses and concubines, often with the tacit knowledge of everyone around them, including the clergy. What changed was the legal and moral framework within which these practices operated. If before ecclesiastical regulation a noble could maintain multiple partners with relative openness, now he was forced to do so more discreetly, maintaining the appearance of monogamy while conducting his parallel relationships behind the scenes. Polygamy did not disappear. It became clandestine. This institutionalized hypocrisy was sustained by a system of mutual benefits between the nobility and the clergy. Nobles who kept concubines compensated for the church's tolerance with generous donations of land, money, and privileges. Bishops and abbots who turned a blind eye to the marital irregularities of the powerful received political protection and material resources in return. The church knew that directly confronting the nobility meant risking the loss of power and influence, and the nobility knew that maintaining a cordial relationship with the church was essential for the legitimacy of their rule. This delicate balance lasted for centuries and deeply shaped how medieval society dealt with issues of marriage, sexuality, and power. While Western Christendom navigated these internal contradictions, in southern Europe, in the territories of the Iberian Peninsula under Muslim rule, a completely different model of marriage and family organization was in force. The Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, which began in 701 with the defeat of the Visigothic king Roderick, introduced into Western Europe a legal and social system based on Islamic law, which explicitly allowed polygamy. According to Islamic jurisprudence, a Muslim man could have up to 4 simultaneous wives, provided he could treat them with equality and justice, and he could also keep concubines. Al-Andalus, as the Iberian territories under Muslim rule were called, became a space of coexistence between 3 distinct religious and matrimonial traditions: the Christian, which preached monogamy; the Jewish, which in practice had adopted both monogamy and polygamy depending on the cultural context in which it lived; and the Islamic, which legally allowed polygamy. This coexistence of such different traditions in the same territory revealed a medieval Europe much more diverse and complex than the usual simplifications suggest. However, the practice of polygamy in Al-Andalus was more complex than simple legal permission might suggest. The Maliki school of law, which was dominant in Iberian Islamic law, allowed women to include clauses in their marriage contracts that prevented their husbands from taking second wives or long-term concubines. Thus, through the legal system itself, Muslim women in Al-Andalus could exercise a considerable degree of control over their marital lives. In practice, polygamy was more common among the ruling elites, caliphs, emirs, and great lords, than among the general population. The Umayyad caliphs of Córdoba, who ruled Al-Andalus during its period of greatest splendor, frequently married women of diverse origins, including Christian princesses and enslaved women of Iberian origin, as part of their dynastic strategies. The mother of Caliph al-Hakam II, for example, was an enslaved woman of Iberian origin named Marjan, and the mother of his son, Hisham II, was a Basque enslaved woman named Sub. These marriages and intercultural unions were part of a complex social dynamic in which religion, ethnicity, and power intertwined in ways that challenged simple categories. Marriages between members of the Muslim elite and Christian women were not uncommon in Al-Andalus. These unions served as instruments of diplomacy, sealing alliances between the Muslim kingdoms of the south and the Christian kingdoms of the north of the peninsula. The great military leader Al-Mansur, who ruled Al-Andalus de facto at the end of the 10th century, received as wives several Christian princesses offered by northern kings as a way to appease his military campaigns. The Banu Qasi family, Muslim rulers of the Upper Marches, is another notable example of interdynastic marriages between Muslims and Christians. For the Christian chroniclers who observed these practices, Muslim polygamy was a constant source of scandal. The authors of medieval anti-Islamic treatises frequently cited polygamy as proof of the supposed irrationality of Islam. This negative view was, to a large extent, the result of a deliberate misunderstanding of Muslim traditions and a refusal to recognize that similar practices existed, in a veiled form, within Christendom itself. The coexistence of such diverse matrimonial traditions in the Iberian Peninsula offers a revealing perspective on the cultural complexity of medieval Europe. On the same continent, legal systems coexisted that allowed polygamy openly, that prohibited it officially, but tolerated it in practice, and that regulated it according to their own norms. Jewish communities, for example, tended to adopt the practices of the dominant society. Jews under Christian rule predominantly practiced monogamy, while those under Muslim rule showed a greater inclination toward polygamy. This adaptation illustrates how matrimonial practices are shaped not only by religious precepts, but also by social and cultural pressures. As we move into the final centuries of the Middle Ages, the process of consolidating monogamy as the absolute norm in Christian Europe gradually intensified. The Church continued to issue decrees and regulations that sought to control every aspect of marriage, from kinship rules that prevented unions between relatives to the requirement for public ceremonies performed before a priest and witnesses. Theologians such as Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, and Duns Scotus refined the theology of marriage, debating the sacramental nature of the matrimonial union and the conditions for its validity. Thomas Aquinas, the most influential among them, stated that marriage was truly a sacrament and that the very act of mutual consent conferred divine grace upon the spouses. This definition elevated monogamous marriage to a theological level that made any deviation not just a legal infraction, but a sin against the very sacred nature of the union. The Byzantine Empire also maintained monogamy as the legal norm, but the reality was more complicated. Emperors could remarry after the death of a wife, although third and fourth marriages were increasingly frowned upon. The keeping of concubines was not uncommon among the Byzantine elite, revealing that the tension between norm and practice was not exclusive to the West. The process of consolidating monogamy in Western Europe culminated already in the transition between the Middle Ages and the early modern period, with the Council of Trent, held between 1545 and 1563. Although chronologically situated in the modern era, the Council of Trent was deeply marked by issues that had their roots in the medieval period. One of the central motivations of the Council was to respond to the Protestant Reformation, which had challenged the authority of the Church on various issues, including marriage. Interestingly, even among the Protestant reformers, there were some who questioned the absolute prohibition of polygamy. Martin Luther, in some of his writings, recognized that the Bible did not explicitly condemn polygamy, although he did not openly defend it. Philip I, Landgrave of Hesse, one of Luther's main allies, received permission from the reformers to contract a second marriage while the first was still in force, a scandal that shook the Protestant movement. The Council of Trent responded to these issues with firmness. In its decree Tametsi, promulgated in 1563, the Council established that marriages, to be valid, had to be celebrated before a parish priest and at least 2 witnesses. Clandestine marriages, which had been a legal loophole for centuries, were formally invalidated. The Council also unequivocally reaffirmed that marriage was an indissoluble sacrament between a man and a woman, explicitly condemning polygamy as heresy. These determinations represented the culmination of a process that had begun more than 1,000 years earlier, when the early Church Fathers began to defend monogamy as the divine model of marriage. But even after Trent, reality continued to be nuanced. Formal polygamy had been eliminated in Christian Europe. No noble could any longer openly keep multiple wives without facing severe consequences. However, informal polygamy, disguised in the form of official mistresses and tolerated extramarital relations, continued to exist for centuries. The European courts of the following centuries were famous for their favorites and royal mistresses, women who exercised enormous influence despite not being the legitimate wives of the monarchs. What had changed was not so much the behavior itself, but the legal and moral framework within which that behavior was interpreted. The medieval concubine, who had recognized status, was replaced by the modern mistress, whose existence was officially denied but widely known. The Muslim territories of the Iberian Peninsula were gradually conquered by Christian kingdoms throughout a process that became known as the Reconquista. As the Christian kingdoms advanced, Muslim matrimonial practices, including polygamy, were replaced by Christian norms. The fall of Granada in 1492 marked the end of the last Muslim kingdom on the peninsula and symbolically represented the close of a period in which different matrimonial traditions had coexisted in the same territory. The remaining Muslim populations were subjected to increasing pressure to adopt Christian customs, and the final expulsion of the Moriscos, decreed in 1609, ended this chapter of Iberian history. It is tempting to look at this history and see in it a linear narrative of progress. But that would be a simplistic reading. Medieval polygamy was not simply a relic of barbaric times. It was a complex social institution that served specific functions. For the patriarchs of the Old Testament, it was a tool for demographic expansion and alliance formation. For the Frankish kings, it was an instrument of diplomacy. For Viking warriors, it was a strategy for perpetuating lineage. For the caliphs of Al-Andalus, it was an expression of status and a mechanism for integration between different ethnic groups. For the Gaelic chiefs of Ireland, it was a way to ensure heirs. In each context, polygamy operated according to its own rules and logic that made sense within the social framework in which it was embedded. Monogamy, in turn, did not impose itself simply because it was morally superior. It consolidated, through a long process of institutional construction. The Church sought to control sexuality and reproduction as part of its project of moral regulation. Theologians found in monogamy a metaphor for the relationship between Christ and his Church. Jurists saw in the formalization of marriage a way to resolve inheritance disputes, and rulers realized that a monogamous system, by limiting the number of legitimate heirs, reduced succession conflicts. Monogamy was a social construction that served multiple interests and consolidated through centuries of negotiation between different social forces. The history of medieval polygamy forces us to confront certain certainties about marriage. It shows us that the exclusive union between two partners is the product of a long historical process shaped by religious, political, and cultural forces. It reminds us that the boundaries between the acceptable and the unacceptable are human constructions that change over time. And it invites us to look at the past not with judgment, but with curiosity, recognizing that people of other eras lived according to logics different from our own. The castles are now in ruins, and the voices of medieval kings and priests have been lost in the centuries. But the questions they faced, about love, power, and fidelity, remain alive. Each society constructs its own answers to these questions, and none are definitive. The monogamy we inherited from the Middle Ages continues to evolve and reinvent itself. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of this journey, that human institutions, however solid they may seem, are always works in progress, shaped by the needs and contradictions of each era. The first signs of this transformation, visible in the letters of Paul of Tarsus, took shape with the decrees of the Lateran Council and found their most complete expression in the determinations of the Council of Trent. But between these milestones, there was a vast terrain of ambiguities, a terrain in which kings kept silent harems, bishops turned a blind eye to the indiscretions of the powerful, and women of all conditions navigated a system that simultaneously protected and limited them. The history of medieval polygamy is not a story of simple transition. It is a story of permanent tensions between ideal and reality, between law and custom, between faith and power. In the basements of medieval castles, in the scriptoria of monasteries where monks copied laws and sermons, in the markets of Iberian cities where Christians, Muslims, and Jews traded side by side, and in Norse longhouses where warriors told sagas around the fire, the rules of marriage were lived and reinvented by each generation. Today, we look at these practices from the distance of centuries and may be surprised by how much they differ from our norms. But perhaps the greater surprise is discovering that our certainties about marriage and family are the product of historical choices that could have been different. The monogamy we consider natural was built stone by stone, decree after decree, between the pulpit and the throne, over more than 1,000 years. And so we come to the end of another journey through the corridors of the past. If this trip through time awakened your curiosity, if these accounts of kings, concubines, ancient laws, and forgotten traditions made you think about how societies construct their rules and their truths, then the best way to continue this conversation is simple. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next documentary narratives. Each episode is an open door to another chapter of human history, and there are many chapters yet to explore. Leave your comment telling us which aspect of this story most caught your attention, which period or civilization you would like to know better, or simply share your perspective. Your participation enriches this space and helps us bring more and more quality content. And if this video was valuable to you, share it with someone who is also fascinated by history and its unexpected twists. Until the next journey, and thank you for accompanying us this far.